Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. The topic for this video is the cerebrum. And what I want to do first is talk a little bit about the cerebrum and then pull up the picture and make sure we have a nice visual. When we talk about the cerebrum, you should consider this to be your higher center, meaning this is where memory, emotion, consciousness, is being processed or stored. You know, all of the things that we think about when we think about our mind as being unique and special to us, the way we think about things, our particular experiences, all of that is being located in the cerebrum. Anytime you hear anything about a conscious level processing, or very often it is just described as a higher center, we're referring specifically to the cerebrum. When we talk about cerebral cortex, cortex is talking about the outermost tissue layer. And in this case of the brain, it's going to be gray matter. Instead of cerebral cortex, sometimes it's just referred to as the neural cortex. Remember, the significance of the gray matter is that this is a processing center. So when we're talking about the cerebral cortex, we're talking about these areas where information is being processed. Now we'll see that anatomically, we can divide up the cerebrum into 5 primary lobes. So I'm going to kind of star the first 5 on our screen here, which is the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal. But remember, we've learned in lab, these are not the only lobes of the cerebrum. And so we also want to mention a little bit about insula lobe in our conversations here. And we want to go into this topic, Brodmann's areas. So we want to make sure that we talk about that as well. When we talk about our primary lobes, we'll see that they have a distinct anatomical region, but they also have a distinct physiological function. So when we talk about our frontal lobe, we should think about this as processing our motor functions. Really, we're thinking here about control of skeletal muscle. This is going to be where our upper motor neurons are located. So some of you picked up on that in our reading from chapter 12. We'll talk about that more when we get into chapter 14. So that'll be an area that we talk about quite a lot. We'll see an anatomical area here called the precentral gyrus, which is the same thing as the primary motor cortex. So precentral gyrus is telling us more like this is the anatomical location, and primary motor cortex is telling us more about physiological function. This is like the physiological name. This area, these cells are responsible for the control of the motor functions, the control of the skeletal muscle. This is actually where the upper motor neuron cell body is located. This isn't the only job in the frontal lobe. We'll also see what's called Broca's area located here, and it has an important connection with language. So we'll see that as well. We can also sort of mention here, I'm going to take it off to the side, the prefrontal cortex. Many of you have heard of this particular structure before. The prefrontal cortex or the prefrontal lobe develops in our 20s. So those of you who are younger, maybe 18, 19, 20, 21, you're still in the developmental process of this part of the brain. So you're still actively developing in your brain. The prefrontal cortex is important in predicting consequences of our actions. And so this does actually go a long way in explaining why when you get into your 30s and your 40s, you look back at some of the choices you made as a teenager and in your early 20s, and you think like, what was I thinking? Well, to some extent, your brain is still developing. And so you weren't really developmentally able to make some of those decisions. We see a lot of our personality is kind of housed here. And we see a lot of our short-term memory is kind of housed in this particular location as well. Moving to the parietal lobe, we'll see that, we'll see it has an involvement in what's called somatosensation. Somatosensation. Soma, remember, means body. So these are the sensation of your body, right? These are the sensations of your body. Sometimes we'll call these like general senses. A general sense is different from a special sense. So like vision is a special sense. You have this hugely complex anatomical structure of the eyeball that's job is to get those wavelengths of light and then be able to like process and understand those wavelengths of light, right? For vision, that's complicated. That's a special sense. Somatosensation is talking about touch, pressure, vibration, pain, temperature, tickle, itch, but also what's called proprioception. This maybe you've not heard of before. Proprioception is detected at our synovial joints. So we can think about it as kind of understanding the position of our body in space. And then sort of along with that, we have what's described as kinesthesia. And this is our sensation of our physical like movements. So not just the position of our body in space, but the way that our body is moving in space. Now we have sort of a similar situation here where this is located anatomically at the post-central gyrus, or we can call this the primary somatosensory cortex. And so same story, post-central gyrus is more like the anatomical name or designation, whereas primary somatosensory cortex is more the physiological name. And we'll be talking about both of these pre-central and post-central gyrus in our lab, and these will come up again in chapter 14. When we talk about the occipital lobe, I think it's fair to think about this as our primary visual cortex. And when we talk about it as a visual cortex, we're saying visual processing center. It's the part of the cortex that processes vision. Visual information is being processed also other parts of the brain, but this is the primary. And we can think about the temporal as our primary auditory and olfactory cortex. We also see temporal lobe important in establishing long-term memory. Okay. Next up, let's mention about the insular lobe. So the insular lobe we'll see is going to have our gustatory center or cortex. So this will be important when we get into our study of special senses and then in the future. And then we have this idea of Brodmann's areas. And so Brodmann's areas, Brodmann in 1900s did a study of the brain, and he divided up the cortex into 52 separate regions. And he numbered them. So as like we're reading in the book, I might say this is Brodmann's area 1 and 2 or 5 and 7 or whatever it is. So you might see that in some other reading. We won't really get into it much more than that. Let's take a look at the brain. So this is a picture primarily of the cerebrum. This is a model that we have in our laboratory. So if you look, we're seeing, you know, the largest, so the cerebrum, we've already called it a higher center. This is where anything that's consciously processed is being processed, so conscious level processing. It's the largest part of the brain. It's highly folded. And this is important because it increases surface area. So all of that folding is giving us more cortex. Cortex is that outer layer. So by folding up that outer layer rather than making it smooth, we have more processing centers. We have more gray matter. We have more nuclei, right? So that's going to be super important. So what we're looking at here is the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. We're able to see all of the folds. It is divided up into a left and a right hemisphere. So in this picture, you're able to see the left hemisphere as sort of that tan colored, and then there's a line dividing, and we call this line the longitudinal fissure, where the term fissure is talking about a pretty deep groove. And so the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are divided by this longitudinal fissure. And I'm actually going to just kind of label right hemisphere down below so I have room to label all of my lobes. What I wanted to do with this particular image is show us the frontal lobe is going to be the most anterior part of the cerebrum, so it's at the very front. And if you put your hands kind of like on your forehead area, that would be where the frontal lobe is located. It's the same as frontal bone, so we have that same terminology. If you move your hands back and kind of stop at the top of your head, underneath the parietal bone, you would have the parietal lobe. And then if you continue your hands down to the back of your head underneath the occipital bone, you would have the occipital lobe. And we see that showing here in the model picture as being green in color. If you bring your hands around to the sides of your head in that area above like your ear or that area surrounding your ear underneath the temporal bone, we have the temporal lobe. And so here we're able to see the 4 primary lobes of the cerebrum. Notice on this model, we have this gray tissue underneath the cerebrum, which is called the cerebellum. And so we're going to talk about this structure in a later video. Now, if you notice where the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe sort of come together, there's another fissure there. It's really described here as a sulcus. So sulcus is also a depression, but it's more shallow. If you were to sort of like pull down on that temporal lobe, you might see the insular lobe So I'm going to make a note here that it's deep to the temporal lobe. I do think we'll be able to look at it on another diagram in future video. When we talk about all of the folding in the cortex that's showing us more surface area, we're going to see that the term gyri is the plural form of the word gyrus, and this is going to be the raised part of the fold, where the term sulci is the plural form of the word sulcus, and that's going to be the depression. And let's maybe think about it as a shallow depression using the letter S to help us with our memory. When we look at the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, we can see a depression going between, and that depression is called the central central sulcus. And so what we can see is that fold right before the raised part of the fold right before would be the precentral gyrus. That's part of the frontal lobe. We also said we can talk about it as the primary motor cortex. So that's where the upper motor neurons are located. We can do the same thing in the parietal lobe. We have behind the central sulcus, we have the post-central gyrus. And so again, remember that's our anatomical name for our physiological structure, which is the primary somatosensory cortex. The last little bit of information I wanted to pick up here is this idea that we do have left and right hemispheres. And so we do get what's described as hemispheric lateralization. Hemispheric lateralization. And what this is telling us this is talking about when we compare the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, they're not mirror images of each other. They don't process exactly the same thing. There are some differences. So one of the key differences is the left hemisphere controls the right body. So it's a cross. So the right hemisphere is going to control the left body. And remember, if we're going to control that side, we also need to get sensory information from that side. So the left hemisphere is receiving sensory information from the right body and then controlling the right body. The left hemisphere is primarily involved in language function and analytical functions or tasks. Whereas the right hemisphere is involved in analyzing sensory information. It's helping to identify objects, faces, and emotion. We can describe all that as spatial and nonverbal reasoning. And so even though we see languages functioning on the left side, the right side is still important in helping us to kind of see, understand what's going on in the world. And then of course, the left side is helping us to kind of voice that. So we do see that both sides of the cerebrum are going to be important for our everyday functioning and that they're working together for the everyday functioning. All right. That's it for the cerebrum. Stay tuned for the diencephalon next. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.